Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. I'm Ed Humferson, and I've gotten to find my phone off. Is that any better? I'm Ed Humferson. I'm the head of the Office for Statistics Regulation. For those of you who are not from the UK, we are the organisation that sets the standards for official statistics published by any part of government, and then we enforce those standards through various kinds of reviews and so on. And in fact, one of our reviews is going to be the centerpiece of today's talks. So this talk is about GDP, and particularly it's about the revisions of GDP based on an experience that took place here in the UK last autumn when there were some significant revisions of GDP. And there's lots of stuff about the measurement of GDP in this story, but there are also things which I think are much more generally applicable to economic measurement. Things like uncertainty, how to understand uncertainty, how to communicate uncertainty, things like how to relate economic measurement to the narratives that are told about how the economy is performing. Things about trust and public understanding and public communication. And it may be, as we hear from the panel, you will think of other themes which are not just relevant to GDP, but are also relevant to many other aspects of economic measurement. So it's kind of a test case. It's like a use case for some, I think, really rich and important issues. But let's set the story first. In September of last year, September of 2023, the UK's National Statistical Institute, the Office for National Statistics, published its national accounts, and those national accounts included some revisions to some already published estimates of GDP. And they're shown on this graph, and the blue colour is the 2021 estimate, the red colour is the 2022 estimate, and the kind of amber orange colour is the 2023 estimate. And you can see they're sort of showing, broadly speaking, a similar pattern, but some of the lines are higher than others. What I think the lines don't show, and what I'll bring out, is the difference for the 2022 position. The difference between the red line, the earlier estimate, and the amber line, the later estimate, is actually the difference from the economy reaching its pre-COVID level, which is anchored at 100 in this graph, reaching its pre-COVID level or not. So the revision effectively said the economy was already larger than its pre-COVID level in 2022. A really significant change to the economic story. And just to put that into words, if you prefer words, picking up on the second bullet here, there was an upward revision in GDP for 2020 of 0.6% and of 2021 of 1.2%. And that's obviously a net of 1.8%. A really significant change in its own right, but as I've said, also significantly important directionally. Not surprisingly, that degree of revision garnered a lot of comment. This is some of the selection of the media stories which emerged at the time. Lots of very kind of factual and straightforward reporting, but I think, as you can see in some of these write-ups, there's some concern, skepticism, perhaps even criticism. Where is it? Britain's statisticians, this is The Economist, I think, Britain's statisticians fix a blunder and find a bigger economy. Obviously, my job, our job at the Office for Statistics Regulation is to respond when there are concerns about the production of any kind of official statistics, including economic statistics. So we thought it'd be a good idea for us to look into these concerns, and you're going to hear about the review we did in a second. So this is actually one of the headlines. OSR, our organisation, to undertake a review of practices around estimates for GDP. And it's worth saying that we did this with the support and encouragement and agreement of the Office for National Statistics, who, as you'll hear, responded very well to the review. Just the running order for today, this is what we're going to talk about. You're going to hear from Marianthi first, from my team. Marianthi led the review. She's going to talk about the review. Then you're going to hear from Sumit from the Office for National Statistics, who's going to talk about the response to the review. Then you're going to hear from Johnny from King's College London, who is I would say he's cornered the market in thinking about the public understanding of economic statistics. He's done the most research and the most interesting research on that topic, very relevant to this. And then we're going to hear from Chris Giles, who is one of the leading economic writers, journalists writing about economics in the UK. And then we're going to have a little conversation amongst the four of us, or chaired by me, and then we'll open up to your Q&A. So that's the running order. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Marianthi to get us going. And you don't need the clicker, do you? So I'll just leave it like that. Thank you. Marianthi, go ahead.
My goodness, we've seen some rather unprecedented changes in both our economy and our society during the past few recent years. But these changes weren't just significant, they were also rapid, continuous, and very cumulative. So, just taking Brexit as an example, that didn't just affect 1 year. We're also seeing the changes of that, the impact of more recent times. Bolt on top of that, a global pandemic, and so many other changes, it becomes quite a challenge to be able to measure economic activity, to pick up signals and to know where to pick up those signals from. Just going through some rather drastic changes that we saw in industries such as air transport, for example, and hospitality, that came to a complete stop during that period, or perhaps the disruptions in global supply chains, which impacted the provision of quite significant products. We know that estimating GDP is quite a complex activity, and during normal economic times, international guidance suggests using 3 approaches in doing so: production, expenditure, and income. However, it is during these times of extreme volatility that users have a more important need for these statistics. They need them to be timely, and they need them to be very reliable, because it's based on this data that they are deriving very important decisions. They need to intervene in order to support society and the economy. Now, it is also important that users that we spoke to understood the trade-off between timeliness and also accuracy. In fact, there is a very clear understanding that having early day access to data is very helpful, it is very valuable, but they also recognize that this means provisions will be made as a result, because data become more comprehensive and more information can come in as the coverage increases. And this can actually take up to 2 years. Therefore, we see revisions as a very normal and unavoidable and inherent part of producing GDP estimates. They're not seen as errors or corrections. This is because GDP is very much a continuously evolving estimate. Now, we also found that the criticism wasn't due to the size of the revision as much as it was to the changing of the narrative about the economy. So we also noticed that other countries had encountered very similar challenges in measuring GDP during COVID. And in addition, the methodologies also vary between the countries, as did the revisions policies and indeed the practices. So, in our experience, we use this review to provide a basis for improvements in order to enhance both the production as well as the communication of statistics. And we identified 3 core themes. The first was around communicating GDP estimates and the uncertainty surrounding it. And this is becoming a lot more important, ensuring that there is very clear communication around that uncertainty as the GDP estimate evolves over time. So, for example, introducing more enhanced qualitative and quantitative analysis that will help the public understand that evolution of the estimate over time and the uncertainty surrounding it. The second main theme was around understanding the users and how do they use these statistics, because developing a much more in-depth understanding of the wide base of users of not just the early estimates, but also the more mature estimates is very important. But more importantly, how do these users interpret the statistics given the uncertainty that surrounds them? There is a need to help users also find information graphically very quickly and with ease surrounding informational revisions without having to flip through various articles to pull out pieces of puzzle in order to put that revision story together. And the third main theme was around quality assurance and reflecting, and how does that reflect all the main changes that happen in the economy? How does that reflect the economic story? And the focus here was very much around improving access to data. There is, the aim here is to be able to maximize and correctly capture economic activity as it happens in different parts of the economy in those early estimates. So these are typically activities that happen during the later period when more rich data becomes available. But bringing that in the early phase really important. And so there's also a need to consider what data sources use and what methods also use in order to become less reliant on that more efficient consumption of the production. So to conclude, we find revisions are very normal and inherent on and on this basis, we do consider that the oldest approach is very appropriate and well managed. However, as economic volatility continues, there's quite a challenge to measure growth, the composition and the size of the economy. It is really important to start placing more emphasis on communicating that uncertainty very clearly as it evolves over time, and also improving access to the data. How we can time it more gradually as well to pick up those signals of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be here today to kind of talk about this, this challenge of uncertainty. So there's kind of three broad themes that I want to talk about today. Firstly, what is uncertainty? Second, why is there uncertainty? And then third, how can we respond to uncertainty? So one of the first points of reflection here is kind of understanding the public perception of uncertainty. And I don't think we always do that enough. And this is where I think the concept of like weather forecasts can be quite useful in terms of just understanding the public viewpoint when it comes to uncertainty. And that's because we always accept that there's going to be uncertainty about tomorrow. You know, for instance, we are perfectly happy when we put on the weather forecast and it says there's going to be a 20% chance of rain tomorrow. I appreciate I'm in Manchester, so it might be a little bit higher than that. But there's only so much that we know about what will come tomorrow. And I think the public understand that concept of uncertainty there. The challenge that NSI's face is that we're talking about uncertainty about the past, and that's not an obvious concept. So, for example, I know if it rained yesterday or not. So people don't always understand that you might change your understanding of what's happened beforehand. And I think that's probably just a key challenge to understand in terms of how NSIs might be able to respond to uncertainty. So why do we have uncertainty? So very quickly, this is the classic trade-off that you've got between timeliness and accuracy of early estimates of GDP. In the UK, we produce our first estimate of GDP around 6 weeks or so after the reference quarter. And when you're faced with, I think it's about £2.5 trillion worth economy, there's only so much information that you're ever going to have at that point in time. So what you're doing is producing an estimate of GDP, particularly that quarterly change is the one that most focus on. Now, the revision itself is not necessarily a challenge or not necessarily one that imposes a cost. It's when it leads to policy error that's a challenge. And I think that's what it's useful to kind of focus on when we talk about data uncertainty. And I kind of want to reflect on three, I say recent instances, they're not that recent, I suppose, but over the last 15 years or so, where we've had contrasting experiences of how you manage uncertainty. And I think there are lessons learned from each of those, things that have been done well, things that have been done less well. So if I go back to the global financial crisis, I think it's safe to say that was really not how to manage uncertainty. That was obviously a challenging time for kind of UK national accountants. But what you saw there was the classic signal versus noise dilemma that policymakers and forecasters were facing in this fog of data uncertainty. So the couple of challenges we got there was the ability to identify the turning point correctly in real time. So if you look at where the economy is today in terms of our understanding of the financial crisis, it's very different to what we were saying in real time. I don't know, 15 years later, I'm allowed to talk about the double dip recession. That never was. I might still be on the ban list, but that was an example of A, the challenges, but I think also B, the communication around that could have been a lot stronger. I wanted to move on to COVID, where I would argue it's not the same experience. And this one, I may not get people agreeing with me on this one, but what we care about really is not so much the revision to GDP itself, but it's the revision to the output gap. And that tells you about how much spare capacity there is in the economy or not. So if I look back at COVID revisions, and Ed showed those earlier, that there were clearly large revisions to the level of GDP. But the 2 points I would make there, I don't see there would have been an alternative policy, optimal policy response. The Bank of England and HM Treasury, they were not waiting for the first estimate of GDP to kind of respond with a policy, let alone a final estimate. And if you look at how the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility responded to those Blue Book revisions, what you may have picked up on is what they did was absorb it into their trend level of GDP. So they left their output gap unchanged. So they were saying, despite those revisions, their understanding of how much spare capacity there was unchanged. It's not to say there was a difference in opinion of how quickly the UK recovered in 2021. And of course, that was the case. But from a policy perspective, I would argue actually the policy cost was relatively low there. The other one I will pick up on is more recently in kind of cost of living crisis. And this is probably a little bit more for media and how we kind of communicate uncertainty there. What we had in the second half of last year was a technical recession, which is a concept I really am not an advocate of, but it's a battle I've lost a few times over the years. It's a rule of thumb that's well understood by all, but I don't think it's a helpful one when we talk about turning points in the economy. And I much prefer the US take on how they do that, which is a focus on the depth, duration, and diffusion of kind of the change in GDP. Now, that technical recession is almost the worst nightmare for an NSI, because what you have in those two periods is a -0.1 and a -0.3. It will not take a lot to shift that to not technically be in a recession. But I would argue if that did happen, it wouldn't really change my understanding of what's taking place in the UK economy. Very quickly, you've had a terms of trade shock that's reduced the purchasing power of UK households and businesses, and that squeeze on real incomes, it's what led to the slowdown. Now, whether it was -0.1 or a flat or 0.1, I don't think my understanding of the economy has changed. And coming back to the output gap, I wouldn't imagine it would change too much there. But if that revision does take place, I can imagine the media headlines going to be ONS revises away its recession, which I think is part of the problem when we try to talk about communications more broadly. I then wanted to come to the OSR recommendations. And to be clear, I kind of spoke with Marianthi during that process. And when I saw the review, I very much endorsed the recommendations there. And I know they were welcome in the ONS itself. But that was a boring take on your recommendation. So I thought I'd be a bit more provocative in terms of where I may challenge a little bit along that one. And there's one in particular, which is your second one, which is ONS needs to improve the presentation of early estimates of GDP and all supporting information it provides on the uncertainty surrounding these estimates, which is a very uncontroversial recommendation. And it is one I would agree with in theory, but I think it's in practice where I would challenge it. And I think there's probably 3 reasons for that. What I would have really liked to have seen in the OSR review, and maybe this is later in the year, you never know, is more of a review about the international practices done by other NSIs. It's easy to say we need to improve how we communicate GDP and uncertainty. It's less easy to kind of say, how do you do that? And what's not in the OSR review is, this is what's done in the US, Canada, Australia, Europe, wherever it might be. And this is what best practice is. And where is that frontier? And where is the UK relative to that? There may be things that the UK does well. There may be things that the UK does less well, but I would have really liked to have seen that bit of it. The second bit is, I think it conflates data uncertainty, which is what I've spoken about, and economic uncertainty. And it's really economic uncertainty is the leading indicator there. And the reason I raise that is typically when you look at uncertainty, they're backward-looking measures. You're looking at revisions of GDP. So you look at the statistical properties and you kind of say, well, past revision is a good indicator where we're going to be today. Now, if I go back to COVID times, I could have taken 5, 10, 20, 30 years worth of data revisions up until COVID. and no interval would have picked up the COVID revisions we saw earlier. So I don't really know how helpful that would have been. And then likewise, if I fast forward 5 years or 10 years, I'm going to pick up those revisions as I look back. And I hope the revisions that we saw there are not going to be indicative of where we are in 2030, or I might need a new job if that is the case. So for me, it's kind of driving through this fog of uncertainty, but doing it via the rear view mirror, which I just don't think is that helpful. The other bit I would then say is around just the recent Bernanke review, which I know was published after the OSR work. For those of you who are not aware of that, that looks into forecasting error and how you can communicate that. I think you can copy and paste a lot of what the recommendations there are on what to do with forecast errors when it comes to data revisions. So quickly just wanted to reflect on what I would do a little bit more on, and then maybe we can come back to this a bit later. I think there are things that the UK does well, particularly with respect to publishing real-time vintages of GDP, revision triangles. It is all there. We do also annual updates that explain the revisions. Could they be better? Yes, of course they could have been. And I think that's obviously a lesson learned from last September. Now, I think in real time, what you could do is every round is its own. I can see, I think, at least 3 former or present deputy directors of national accounts in this room. They've all got their skeletons in their cupboards about which rounds are more tricky than others. Do we communicate that? I would argue not. That said, we do publish, and I won't get into the specifics, but essentially balancing adjustments, which you can argue is a proxy for uncertainty, which I'm not sure other countries do. But I think that's something that could be done a little bit more, just that, even if it's subjective, that judgment on whether there was uncertainty or not. And I think picking up with the Bernanke review, I think there's more that could be done in reviewing in depth significant revisions that take place. Why did they take place? How did they take place? And what are we going to do in response to those things? And that might come back to Marianthi's point about some of the recommendations about improved early data. I imagine that has been the contribution to some of those revisions, particularly with respect to last year's Blue Book. So look, in conclusion, what I want to say is I think the practices of what we do on communicating uncertainty are just founded on transparency. And there are things the UK does well, but I think I'm sure there are things that we can learn more from other countries and even from last year's experience when we look ahead. The final thing I'll say is I'm really not an advocate of these intervals. I know they're quite popular, and I think that was one of the recommendations. It seems like one of the findings or pickups around the Bernanke review was the fan charts, which are in effect the same principle. I don't really know how useful they are. If the only purpose is to say the data might not be final, I think you can just explain that and not look backwards so much, especially when the media never comment on, you know, how subject to revision some of these early estimates are. So I think the things we do well in the UK, which I think is the basis of how we go forward, but I think what we need to probably identify is how can we make it a bit more sustainable to improve and learn from some of the lessons from last year.
Great. Just before we go on to Johnny, just to say, I think it's an iron rule of a conference which takes place in Manchester that every session has to have at least one joke about the rain, and we've already had that joke. So hopefully, gentlemen, you can not follow. Johnny.
Yeah. So I'm going to pick up on this issue of communicating uncertainty of early estimates to the public, to a general non-technical audience, and I must say I'm quite conflicted on it. So in one sense, I can see the advantages, the kind of improved transparency. And that is supported by online experiments that's being done, testing different ways of communicating uncertainty of different economic statistics. So, and that includes 2 ESCoE reports by Anna Galvao and James Mitchell, and also some work by Spiegelhalter and some co-authors. They, through kind of online experiments and testing different versions from basically not indicating any uncertainty to kind of the GDP growth is around 0.2%, so kind of a very very low level indication of uncertainty to very kind of extreme ways of communicating uncertainty where it's very transparent and upfront, and for instance using fan charts and so on. Those kind of studies, they've been done on unemployment, GDP, international comparisons of productivity. And they all kind of show a similar, they all kind of give a similar story that it does in fact actually improve the general public's understanding that these numbers are not accurate. There is some uncertainty. And importantly, there's no kind of effect on trust in the numbers. in the source, the ONS in this case, the trust doesn't increase either, but at least it doesn't undermine trust. So in that sense, there are some good kind of like evidence that this is worth pursuing. But I am skeptical still for a few reasons. So the research that I've done as part of the ESCoE research program on public understanding of economic statistics, one of the kind of most clear findings from that research and from other research in this area is that we need to communicate economics in a more simple, more engaging way, focus on things that the public find interesting, relevant to them, and so on. And in some ways go back to basics and explain what GDP is, why it's relevant to the public. And communicating uncertainty does not feel like going back to basics. The caveat to that is actually on some economic statistics. I think one of the things we have identified is that, for instance, on unemployment, labor market statistics, a good way of explaining that is actually to go back to how is this actually being measured, how's the data collected, and once you explain that and the LFS and so on, you're actually quite a sentence away from explaining that the numbers are not necessarily 100% accurate. We did an ESCoE project, quite small scale, where we did 20 in-depth qualitative interviews, kind of like recruited from a market research company, so it was a good diverse sample, but small sample, where we kind of like explored in a bit more detail how people actually react to this kind of information, that some of these numbers are not 100% certain. And I think it gave some really interesting insights that behind these like kind of aggregated survey findings, when there's a lot of kind of like both understanding and like kind of people find it interesting, often surprising when they hear about this, but there's also misperceptions, especially in terms of like future forecasting uncertainty, but that kind of like comes to people's minds like very quickly, even though it very specifically says about the past estimates. From those interviews, we found kind of supported the story in the surveys about the GDP findings that it does improve people's understanding of uncertainty in GDP numbers. It didn't affect trust, and from those interviews, that was kind of like driven by people just don't know very much about or care very much about GDP for it to like kind of change trust very much. Where on unemployment, people really do care and feel like have quite a lot of preconceived ideas about what it is, how accurate it should or should not be, and quite often think that a common perception is that unemployment figures are derived from like job claimant, benefit claimant data, which would be much more accurate, and so people get very surprised, especially on unemployment specifically, which is a different type of uncertainty, sample uncertainty. People get incredibly surprised and react in various different ways, sometimes very strongly if you actually give them the 95% confidence intervals. But I guess like a takeaway from that is you can say, oh, it's very dangerous to communicate this uncertainty because people get very surprised, sometimes distrusting. Another takeaway is that this is exactly why it's important, because people don't really know that these numbers are uncertain, and therefore get very surprised in these incidents when it actually changes the narrative, and it's kind of a proactive way of addressing that distrust when it changes the narrative. I think the other reason I'm slightly skeptical based on the findings in the online experiments is that online experiments is not real life. If the uncertainty is kind of acknowledged much more proactively by ONS or NSIs, then in real life, those kind of things are picked up by politicians, media, and so on. And there is a risk potentially that different actors can start kind of like cherry picking the figures, and you can like kind of imagine a situation where opposition politician says there's a recession, and government politician says there's not a recession, and just being based on that kind of like fan chart or whatever way the uncertainty is presented. And that's when, you know, our research has shown very clearly that that's when people distrust economic statistics the most. It's when they get this sense that that, you know, that statistics can be manipulated in any way to show kind of like the story that you want to show. Again, I think this is kind of a reason to be cautious, but it might also be a reason for the ONS and other similar organizations to actually be proactive and kind of taking control of that narrative rather than kind of leaving it to other actors and like then having to be reactive afterwards. Yeah, I think I will leave it there.
Great, thank you. Chris.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to first of all react to a couple of things Sumit said. First of all, the weather. So a second mention of, but not rain, wind this time.
Very good.
I'm going to take you back to 1987, October. On the TV, a hapless middle-aged weather forecaster went on, said he had a phone call from someone, a woman who said there was going to be a hurricane that night. There is going to be no hurricane, Michael Fish said. He has not been allowed to forget that for 37 years. So I think, you know, when we're talking about whether people get things, whether the onus has it tough or not, I think people have probably forgotten last year's GDP revisions already. I think I'm one of the unusual people, as probably all of us are in this room, who might not have done. So I don't think it has that same public salience as weather, for example. Secondly, in terms of policy, this is where I think I would disagree again. I think actually it had quite big political effects and policy effects, which you might think are good or bad depending on your point of view. But I've been told this, so this is hearsay. You know, and I will relay this. Someone very senior in the Treasury said that Jeremy Hunt would not have implemented or introduced his childcare subsidies in March 2023 if he didn't feel he needed to have a new growth measure for the economy, and because the UK at the time was measured as the worst performing in the G7 since the pandemic. So you might think that's great. You know, ONS statistics showing a really bad thing, creating a childcare subsidy, we all think is great. It wouldn't have happened had they been more accurate or at the time. And secondly, it's pretty, so that's hearsay, by the way, but let's be absolutely clear about that. The thing that's a little bit, I have more evidence is that the Office Budget Responsibilities estimates they were giving the government as to their fiscal headroom changed very substantially in the autumn of last year. We know that as a fact. And I'm pretty confident about, because I've heard it from many sources, is that the ONS revision was one of the key reasons and the key drivers of those changes in fiscal headroom. And again, you might think that's good or bad news, but I think let's not pretend that it doesn't have quite big political and policy implications. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about you know, the evil people in the room, which is the media. You know, and you know how we go about translating and forgetting about uncertainty when we are the intermediaries between statistical agencies and the public. And I'm going to push back a little bit, because I think when we're looking at what happened last September and in the autumn, these were really very large revisions, and they weren't in any way normal. They absolutely changed the economic narrative. A nearly 2 percentage point increase in the size of the economy, finding, or as we like to put it in the media, finding 50 billion quid down the back of the sofa, is a lot of money. 2% of GDP. We understand. I'm not in any way criticizing the ONS for how it happened. We all understand how difficult economic measurement was in the pandemic. But in the context of a trend UK growth rate of around 1% a year, that means that the ONS found 2 years of growth. At no stage should anyone in ONS or any official circles think that isn't a big story. It's a big story, and it's going to be a big story. And that is the thing that should have been flashing alarm bells within the statistical agencies about how you communicate it, because you know it's going to be a big story. It might not be immediate because it's not a data release. It doesn't come out on GDP day, but it is going to create a lot of interest. So no one should be surprised that it was news. It changed the key narrative of the UK economy being the worst performing since the pandemic in the G7 to being among the European pack. So again, it changed a big thing, and for the government and for politicians, particularly for Conservative politicians, it meant it went from we've got something we're doing really badly and we have to explain to look at Germany, they're doing much worse than us. And that showed why there was, I would say, a lot of annoyance in the Treasury, which is obviously the ONS's parent department within the Treasury, were on the 1st of September ringing people up and ringing the media up saying, have you seen this? This is really important. You should be reporting it. We'd already reported it at the FT, so we didn't feel we needed to take advice from the Treasury on these things. But I just would point out that that was happening on the day. At no time did ONS before these revisions suggest that a comparison of levels between to the pre-pandemic level was not the correct and best way of looking at the UK economy in the post-pandemic period. In fact, the ONS used that measure as its headline measure in GDP releases all the way up to the summer of 2023. In paragraph or section 11 of their GDP releases, that was section 2 of their GDP releases. In section 11 of their GDP releases, they said things might be a little bit more uncertain than usual. People don't get down to section 11. The press does read, and media outlets do read when ONS puts warnings in their GDP releases higher. And then you'll see this on Twitter or on X or whatever we call it these days. You'll see people mentioning this quite regularly, where particularly the labour force data at the moment, where these are very prominent, these things come out. So the press doesn't just ignore uncertainty, and these things are often commented on, but the uncertainty of the level of GDP was not flagged by ONS before the 1st of September. And then I just wanted to go to the 1st of September release, just because I think if I read a little bit to you, you'll realise why maybe some of the coverage was as it was. So the headline of the release was Impact of Blue Book 2023 Changes on Gross Domestic Product, Impact of Methodological and Data Improvements on Current Price and Change Volume Measures of Quarterly Gross Domestic Product, GDP, 1997 to 2021. It's not a very catchy title, it doesn't tell you what's in the release. The overview just says 2023 annual national accounts, known as the Blue Book, will incorporate a wide range of improvements. There's always improvements in the ONS, by the way. That word is a red rag to me. It's a real problematic word. To sources and methods, and these includes then a load of bullet points, blah, 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 blah. And then 2, main impact of our changes. Well, Ed put up the main impact. And he was absolutely correct, exactly correct in what he said. It was a 2 percentage point upward revision, problematically coming from a 2 percentage point downward revision the year before. So it looked very much, if you'd been following these things, as if the ONS had overestimated GDP, put it down, and then realised that its first revision was wrong and went back to the first position it was in the first place. So, but the main impact, section 2, was revisions from 1997 to 2019 are generally small. That was the headline that the owners put out, comma, however, there are larger revisions to 2020 and 21, although quarterly and monthly profile through the years is relatively little change. That's just not true. I mean, on any reasonable basis, the first thing the owners said about it isn't true. The moment you do that, and journalists are not stupid, and then they find out what the real number is, you found 2 years of GDP growth, and you've not put it in at the top of your press release. We think you're trying to cover things up. And so you are going to get much, much harder press the moment you do that. In fact, it came in the 4th bullet, upward revisions to annual volume GDP growth for 2020 and 2021 mean that GDP is now estimated to be 0.6 above pre-COVID level. And previously, this was estimated at 1.2% below. That should have been the headline. You know, there is absolutely no doubt about it. That should have been the headline. If you are going to make big changes, you need to be honest about them, and then you need to show you're working. And then, so the more that happens, so our day 2 piece, we put this as a splash on the FT. It was our splash. Thousands of comments. Lots of other people followed us because we were first with the story, even though it was released. But it looked as if, and lots of other people in other news organisations I know thought that ONS was trying to cover things up. But then when you went down into the detail of the release, you found some really quite extraordinary numbers, such as that in the previous data between 2019 and 2021, steel output had been shown to have risen in those 2 years by 56%, and in the revised data, it was down 66%. So was there any explanation of what was going on? No, nothing. There was quite a lot of talk about most of this came from the wholesale and retail trade, and was to do with margins, but at no stage did it appear that anyone in the statistical agency had looked at the data with a critical eye and said, what's going on here? We need to explain something. It's not that people don't understand that revisions are part of GDP statistics. People understand that completely. But they want to know when they're big, what are they about? And it's quite like, and that would be the one thing, if I have one thing to advise, is be just front it all up. Be completely transparent. Find the most extreme revisions that you've done, because someone else will. You know that people out there are looking for these things. And so don't think it will suddenly go away. Just go out and show it.
Chris, can I just stop you there, because you stopped on a very constructive piece of advice, which is front it all up. I think there's probably more points that you have that we can bring out in Q&A, but I am keen that we invite comments from you as an audience, questions, thoughts, observations. Very rich discussion. I have a final question, which I'm going to ask each of you at the end. But let's just see if there are any thoughts, observations, reflections. We've already got a couple of hands. We've got Joe here in the middle, so we'll go for Joe first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a very insightful set of panel comments. I got quite nostalgic about some of this actually, because some of this, not all, but some of it, about how to convey uncertainty about GDP issues of timeliness, no revisions, 5 years, all that sort of thing. That actually, when I was chief economist at ONS, we dealt with a number of times, not least in the I think the advice we had then and the advice of the Marianthi seemed quite familiar, and we just need to keep doing this. What was special, and I think Chris Giles' point, is that ONS, by the sound of things, didn't actually appreciate how much impact this was going to have, and didn't put in place the kind of what are we going to do about this? What is our strategy for dealing with these issues we have? Maybe that's where ONS needs to think about how do we handle these kind of large and special. And one question about improvements, which I think. First of all, I do actually entirely agree with Chris Giles. ONS probably doesn't do stuff in favors by boasting about its improvements. A lot of time you get transformative strategies, and lots of stuff about how our ambitious program has worked is going to lead to. That's something else about ONS, how well they're doing, don't concern themselves. But secondly, an issue about how you do deal with genuine improvements. Context of a conference like we have today, and the aim is to get better methodologies, get measures, better measures using new data sources. How do you deal with people saying, well, you've now got completely different estimates because you're a so-called better methodology. Does that mean what you have to say is global rubbish and change themselves? So I'd be interested in how you handle that incorporation of genuinely better methodologies into the presentation of our
Thank you very much. Sumit, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that really interesting point about when you're making genuine improvements, how to handle the sort of user skepticism about the impact on what's already been done in the past.
Yeah, and I can cover that off. So I suppose, and I didn't really do it myself, when you get revisions, there's typically two types of revisions. There's data revisions, which is this timeless accuracy trade-off where you've just got more information and you process that. But you do have, as part of a blue book, genuine genuine methodological changes that come in.
We'll call it the I word.
Yes, indeed. I'm allowed to, yes. So, and I think with those ones, what you can do is be much more explicit that in this blue book, for example, we have incorporated X, Y, and Z to tackle, the measurement challenge of what it might be. So the famous example, I suppose, would be when our research and development became capitalized, I think that's about 10 years ago now, where that led to an improvement, we would say, in how we recorded investment, because previously that was treated as kind of current expenditure and then it became capital. I think what you could potentially do, although it is quite challenging, can you unpick, when you put forward a revision of X percentage points to a change in GDP, how much of it's data and how much of it's a methodological one? And we have done that in the past. We do current price GDP. And that might be one way you can kind of unpick those two. And so there is a bit more the positive coverage of, yes, this is a genuine improvement in how we record, as I say, a particular bit of the economy.
Right, thank you. I mean, there's a lot in that, and it'd be interesting to get Chris's thoughts on that. But actually, I'd rather go and get some more questions. So I think there was a question right at the back, gentleman right at the back had his hand up. Has that hand been retracted? Looks like it has. Somebody else, gentleman here then.
Could you wait for the microphone, please? Could everyone speak into the microphone because people online can't hear the questions? Thank you.
Leonard McNamara, Bank of Philadelphia. So when I was at the Fed, I was one of the people who was involved in kind of tracking revisions and stuff like that. And there are two observations I have. One is that revised underlying data is often available substantially before the actual release of GDP. And you could signal, as we do internally within the Fed, that there is a change coming. And that would help soften the blow, and you could explain exactly how the new data release has changed your view, and thus educate the population about exactly how the data is being created. And the same thing goes for methodological revisions. BEA signals well in advance what the methodological revisions are going to be. Then publishes what its revisions are going to be, and then you get the revised data. So, you could do, and again, those are also opportunities for teaching the leadership about the availability. That's something that's going to change.
Brilliant, thank you. Chris, be interested in your perspective on that as a, so to speak, a professional user. And also, Johnny, then your perspective, how the public might deal with the sort of signaling approach that Leonard outlines.
I mean, I think that actually the ONS is really not good at that. I mean, all the release I was talking about was exactly that. It was a pre-release. It wasn't the actual data. It was an advance warning of the data. So the ONS, I think, has been really rather good at that. What it was not good at was realizing, I think, internally how big this was going to be, because it was there, and so whether you needed a pre, I don't think you need a pre announcement, because it was in the calendar as the moment that we were going to understand what the annual revisions were going to be. It's just that the actual release itself didn't really explain them.
And Johnny, a perspective from sort of thinking about the public?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether the public is going to kind of a signal is going to like kind of change. It kind of depends how the media reports it, I guess. But yeah, I don't really have anything on that.
Okay, thank you. More questions. We have a question right here at the front.
Thank you. We only heard anybody's mention of what was going on almost simultaneously at Bank of England, admittedly respective forecasts in particular. But I would like a little more explanation, because there's two things about uncertainty, what we trust and how we view things. They're two debates we're going on. Chris was writing about sort of one day to the next. And I think there might well have been some lessons, and it's not just enough to say, oh, well, yes, we do look at that as something that is useful. Could you say a bit more about, because I was intrigued that it was barely mentioned and only mentioned in passing.
So do you have any reflections on that?
Was this on lessons learned and retrospective changes?
With respect to uncertainty and what was understood by uncertainty, what was understood by hand charts, what was understood by errors, what was being communicated, because that was what Barnacle was telling us about. He just talked about it about future inflation, frankly, but it's the same thing being said about everything else.
So there are probably two reflections there. So what fan charts do in the Bank of England is they reflect the distribution of forecast errors over a period of time. I think it's about 20 years beforehand, but they also include a subjective take. So instead of being symmetrical, they can be asymmetrical. So what you could do in theory is with GDP. We publish real-time vintages of GDP, so you could easily work out the same distribution. But the problem I was trying to articulate is that's always backward looking. So when we look at the the Blue Book 23 revisions, if you're done that exercise, they would have reflected the statistical property of GDP revisions over, for example, 2010 Q1 to 2019 Q4, which are obviously going to be much smaller, because one thing people don't always do is they take a mean revision of X percentage points. And normally you don't have to do it conditional to the point estimate, because if you looked at the history prior to COVID, I would imagine it's probably 98% of all, if not more, of all of those. Well, yeah, probably about 95% would be my guess of quarterly changes are between plus and minus 1%. Now, we were faced with, obviously, in 2020, I think, I don't know the latest estimate, but it was around 20% fall. I think it was a 15% bounce back. So a revision, a historical revision, wouldn't have been, I don't think, particularly informative of the uncertainty at that point in time. It's obviously difficult for the ONS to kind of put in then a subjective view of how you would change that distribution, but I feel you could do it with words. And that's something that could be more constructive. I think that's probably what Chris is getting to in terms of that September 1st publication. Could that have been more explicit and clearer as to what was going on and why? So I think that's probably where I would say, I said, the communication is not so much for me a quantitative one, but much stronger and qualitative. And I'm picking, whether it be the industry level revisions, whether it be expenditure components, whatever it might be, but roughly the 2% level shift, what was really going on there.
Chris, we were talking about this earlier. Anything to add?
Just very quickly, I mean, I think this is partly exactly what Sumit said, I think is entirely correct. And what Ben Bernanke was criticising at the bank was that the fan charts were basically had a whole bunch of ad hoc fiddles in them, which the people could no longer explain why they'd done them, because documentation wasn't great in the past, and also they're not wonderful communication devices. We stopped publishing fan charts in the FT in about 2011 because you couldn't, if you put the two from the two corresponding reports next to each other, you normally couldn't see a difference in them, but the language in the report was different. So how you were reporting changes when you had charts, you needed to get a ruler out to see what had changed on them, was really rather difficult. So we went to just taking the central forecast and showing the previous central forecast, which actually is quite a good way of showing uncertainty in itself, because just as Ed did earlier, where you have the lines, and if you say, well, these are all our best guess at the time, then that shows that the data is quite uncertain.
Thank you. Sarah, I did promise I'd ask if there are any questions on Slido.
There are.
There aren't. Okay. Well, I think we've got time for one more question. So, yes, you know, right at the front. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? I realize the panel is very much about measurement and working better, and I completely take all points on bringing up change, etc. But can I ask, since I'm the last question, go back to the ego media point, and say we saw kind of a big range of ways to report something. I'm a competition for most writers, so statistics is important, but words sometimes are more powerful. Now I understand why economy healthier than first thought is not getting as many clicks as lies damn lies. But I guess sort of one of the challenges of communicating uncertainty also comes from how that is amplified later in ways that sometimes, I'm not going to call it irresponsible, but if you had to have a fan chart around kind of exaggerated and the main sort of in relation to the revision, yeah, I guess to what extent do you consider how this is communicated to the public versus what is then the impact both on the statistics, on sort of trust in future statistics, trust in an institution in relation to the change that you saw. So there's long-term impact, I guess, and responsibility in the way that you communicate and the way that you use language, yeah, that are wider.
I fully agree. Lots of bits of the media are irresponsible. Let's be absolutely clear about that. I don't think many of the examples put up there were irresponsible. The lies down lies and ONS statistics was a comment piece in the Times. If you read it, which I have read it, just reread it on the trade up here, it's perfectly reasonable. Headlines are a little bit strong, but it's a comment piece. It's not a news report. Let's be absolutely clear what sort of piece of journalism it was. It was fair comment by Patrick Hoskin, who's a perfectly good reporter. The ones I thought were up there were really bad was now the ONS has been forced to fess up and change its predictions. For one, they're not predictions. Two, you weren't forced to do anything. You did it all off the ONS's own back, and there was no fessing up in so that one was really, really terrible. And revisions give economy surprise lift. The economy was the same as before. It was just that our measurement was different. So that was just wrong. But nearly all the other ones, and I went to look at them, I think have been basically fine. But that doesn't mean that all economic reporting is fine. I think a lot of it is exaggerated. Quite often, a lot of it's partisan, so it's done through a particular lens, and this is all problematic for trust. And just to show that I think we have many of the same issues that ONS has, we have, and this I think goes for many news organizations, we have corrections. We get things wrong, we put corrections in. Externally, it looks like a correction is just something you found you got something wrong, you put a correction in either at the bottom of an online article or in the paper the next day. Internally, you get in a lot of trouble. I think it's really bad because lots of ways then everyone is much less willing to fess up because you can get away with it. Most times you will get away with it if you don't fess up. And I think that is also, it means that we and people don't get the information they should have. And I think that might be, I don't know, this is a theory of mine, but it might be maybe what's going on in the ONS, that people will feel uncomfortable about saying there are all these things that went on with our previous version of the statistics, and we should be really, really open and honest about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I should have stepped in as chair and brought it to a close, but I just so enjoyed Chris being asked a difficult question that I let it run on for a bit. I think it's been a fantastic session. I'm sorry that we haven't had opportunity to bring you all in very much in the Q&A, but that's because there were good questions and really interesting comments. A really fascinating topic. Thank you very much for listening, and please join me in thanking the panelists.